Hello, and welcome to Pit Exchange, a podcast by Currency Research. Join us as we discuss the latest in payments, innovation, and technology with the industry's most innovative thought leaders. Today, we're bringing you something special, the CBPC Roadshow. 4 exclusive conversations with leaders from across the global payments ecosystem, leading up to the Central Bank Payments Conference this August. Today's payments are changing and moving around the world faster than ever before, and Pit Exchange gives you the knowledge and insights to keep up. Sit back and relax as we join Currency Research, exchanging ideas with today's CBPC Roadshow guest.
Welcome to another episode of the Pit Exchange, Payments, Innovation and Technology. My name is Jens Seidel and I'm your host for today's episode. I'm very happy to have Shriyanka Hore with us from Swift in London today. Shriyanka, welcome.
Absolute pleasure to be on the show, Jens, and good speaking to you again.
Likewise, thank you. I've known Shriyanka for quite a few years now. We've been meeting at different conferences in Frankfurt from time to time as well, or in London. So it's great to have a familiar face with us today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. As usual in my episodes, I like to start with 3 semi-personal questions, just to get to know the person, Shriyanka, before we start talking about payments and what's happening at Swift. So the first very easy one, do you prefer tea or coffee?
Tea. I'm a tea person, Jens.
Okay, what kind of tea, if I may ask?
Oh, that changes based on the time of the day. Breakfast tea in the morning, and I end my day with a mint tea.
All right. I have to admit I'm more of a tea person now as well after I lived for 5 years in the UK. That changed my whole outlook on tea completely.
No wonder we're friends.
Yes. Okay, good then. Second question. What is your favorite cuisine?
Well, I am quite a foodie, but I love to cook Indian food, and I quite enjoy the cuisine and all the flavors it has to offer.
Okay, all right, nice. And last question, and that is one where we talked about this previously, so this is more for our listeners rather than me learning something new about you. You play an instrument. Do you want to talk a little bit to us about that? What instrument do you play?
Oh dear. Yes, I do play the sitar, which is a classical Indian instrument, but I like to try contemporary tunes on it.
Oh, wow. I haven't heard you play it yet, and hopefully one day I will get an opportunity. That sounds fascinating, especially the contemporary music on a sitar. That sounds cool.
Indeed.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that. And now let's start to talk about a little bit more about you and your professional context. So you work with Swift. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what your role is at Swift and what you do there?
I lead up global industry relations at Swift, and I also work alongside the industry. So, you can think of my team as the critical link between ongoing developments in the industry. We analyze the strategic forces across policy, markets, technology that shape not only operations at Swift, but the trajectory of the entire Swift community, and the industry at large. And I work increasingly with senior stakeholders, regulators, market infrastructure banks, with a laser-sharp focus on development of policy and how technology will impact the future of finance.
Okay. And maybe taking a step back, and I'm assuming that most people that will listen to this podcast will know who Swift is, but I've been observing quite a change in the way Swift is positioning itself now over the last few years as well, where Swift for, I think, many years has been that messaging service, to put it really easy in very easy terms, but it's so much more. Do you want to talk a little bit about that maybe?
Yes, thank you for asking that. I mean, when you think Swift, you think different things. You think correspondent banking networks, sometimes you think Swift messages, but at the heart of what Swift is, it is a community. We are a global cooperative that sits at the heart of the global financial ecosystem. We have over 11,500 financial institutions on our network, and we operate in over 220 plus countries. And over 145 plus currencies move across our network every single day, amounting to the world's GDP. That's the kind of scale SWIFT has. When I say world's GDP, it's every 3 days we see that. In terms of the evolution of SWIFT over the years, we started off with being a point-to-point messaging network. But over the years, it's become synonymous to trust, resilience. It is the ecosystem that underpins trust in global finance in a way. And we play a very significant role as the registration authority of the ISO 20022. And we are also responsible for uplifting the quality of messaging standards and data standards for the industry. And you see it with the recent adoption of ISO 20022 across the network. Today, we have over 98% of messages and structured data that allows for better screening, automation, and paves the way for a data-led way of intelligent systems and how it works. So to sum it up, Jens, indeed, there's been a lot of evolution from becoming, the network of trust for point-to-point messaging to taking on a more advanced role of actually being the orchestrator for transactions, and end-to-end life cycle management in some ways, from traceability, tracking, predictability, even before the transaction originates. So we have gone through a whole journey over the last 50 years in terms of how transactions originate, are tracked, screened, and move across the network.
Okay, well, there's a lot more change coming, obviously, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But maybe before that, again, I don't want to presume for our listeners that they fully understand how SWIFT operates. Can you talk a little bit about the ownership structure of SWIFT as well? Who's actually behind SWIFT? How does that work?
Well, we are a network of banks, but it is not limited to banks. We have banks and non-banks on the network. We operate over 200 plus market infrastructures as a technical operator in domestic markets. And the governance, we've gone through a whole evolution of the governance at this point. And you will hear more about it in the year to come in terms of how we are becoming more inclusive, even from a governance standpoint. But we've always been overseen by the G10 central banks, and the shareholders are the banks. So it's a true public-private partnership that has sustained the tests of time. And the ups and downs from macroeconomics to geopolitical shifts and all of that that comes with it. And now we're using technology to pivot us into the future of building that future of finance. And I'm very eager to speak to you about that, Jens.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on to that then. Talking about the future of finance, and obviously I think there's added complexity ahead of us, right? There's new technologies coming up, whether it is tokenized deposits, stable coins, faster payment systems, etc. There's so many innovations in not just the user experience, but the underlying technology that enables user experiences. So how is that changing SWIFT? How does that change the role of SWIFT in that ecosystem?
I don't think the role of SWIFT changes. I think the service levels of SWIFT, we continuously try and raise that bar. And it's not only at SWIFT, it is because payments is a team sport, and that is where you can establish better, more enhanced rules of offering customer service. So it's a very organic process in how we do that. So let's first talk about cross-border payments, because although SWIFT is the messaging network for cross-border trade, FX, securities, let's zoom in a little bit into payments today. So, but in the whole life cycle of a cross-border payment, we see very fast movement of transactions across the cross-border mile. But when it reaches the domestic mile, that is where a number of frictions exist, and that is what is really responsible for the slow slow cross-border payments angle to which many people um, kind of associate frictions to. And some of these frictions are, I wouldn't call them frictions because they're inherent features of the monetary architecture of that sovereign jurisdiction. It could be around capital and FX controls, currency repatriation draws, regulatory reporting around foreign proceeds, and so on. So the need to stop, check, document, and then credit is really what is driven sometimes by overlapping regulations and controls that exist. But over time, infrastructure in the last mile, we've seen a great evolution there because RTGSs we know operate for limited hours, and then we have a number of fast payment systems which have come up over the years, but are also opening up to cross-border payments. Now, in that journey, we are enforcing a newer service level agreement across the network, which we call scheme. And what it does is it taps into the faster last mile that exists in jurisdictions now. And it enforces, or rather, it's an optional scheme that has been built very inclusively with over 40 banks. But it really aims to drive better upfront predictability of payments by disclosure of fees and FX early on, even before the transaction starts, full end-to-end visibility of the journey of the payment, and most importantly, no deducts, and the credit is on the same day. So everything around delayed payments, it's really about changing and shifting the game. And all of this is specifically tailored to retail and SME payments. So we are continuously enhancing better service levels and predictability on the first mile, right? Even before the payment starts, the cross-border mile in terms of resilience, in terms of better traceability, and then now extending it to solve the frictions of the last mile. But that is a different angle altogether, but because some of these frictions are beyond the control of infrastructure or any one single institution.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's no coincidence that a lot of the topics you mentioned there are obviously aligning with the G20 initiative as well to improve cross-border payments strategically, right? You mentioned transparency there, for instance, seeing what fees or exchange rates will be early on in the transaction, traceability, et cetera, so speed, obviously. So I'm guessing this is very much in or keeping the G20 roadmap in mind. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. So our strategy has always been aligned towards instant, frictionless cross-border payments, and that also aligns very closely to the G20 roadmap. Now, while we are, uplifting the service levels on existing traditional rails, we are going in for a two-track parallel innovation strategy. And the second prong is around bringing a new layer into our infrastructure, which is blockchain based. So we're introducing a shared ledger. Again, it's almost optional, but we see some of the largest banks come onto the ledger initiative. And here we are building a minimum viable product. And we're going to evaluate how distributed ledger technology and tokenized deposits can unlock better liquidity and visibility of cash positions for commercial banks through the through 24/7 operations. So it's really about unlocking the power of 24/7 with DLT. And this is targeted primarily towards wholesale cross-border payments, whereas everything to do with Scheme is about bringing all of the best practices we've developed for wholesale to serve retail and consumer where cost remains a challenge, and the service levels can not only improve cross-border payments for the end users, but also lower cost collectively in the larger scheme of things.
Yeah, and I think that's also interesting because that seems to be the consensus, at least across most of the industry, that the DLT technology and tokenization is really important and something that should be driven forward quite quickly in the wholesale space, while on the retail side, the jury's still out, so to say. So that again, your strategy seems to align with that current view of focused tokenization on the wholesale space, but let's use conventional measures, if you like, when looking at improving the retail side of payments.
Absolutely. What we are preparing for is a multi-model, multi-rail, multi-chain, and a multi-asset world, right? So newer forms of money will continue to emerge, and Swift's role will remain unchanged at the end of the day. So how do you prepare for that? And interoperability remains a core value and ethos of our strategy as well. So whether you look at it in terms of bringing standardized data, standardized rules, policies, service level frameworks, it is really about ensuring that the end user should be agnostic to the rails behind it, right? It should always have that comfort, that predictability and trust of making payments through a formal banking system. So that is where we really kind of align our efforts today.
Got it. So where do you see then the biggest priorities when it comes to modernizing cross-border payments? What are the key areas that we should focus on?
Because I think, we're really talking about evolution of today's rails and, a complete area of exploration of how systems of the future, intelligent systems, autonomous systems will kind of come in. I think let's first break it down into leveraging infrastructure that is being built in sovereign jurisdictions to cater to fast payments. Today, typically fast payments systems in country were built to serve the local economy, domestic only. And as these fast payment systems today open up for cross-border, bring on schemes like One Leg Out, there is immense potential to impact the speed of payments. So 24/7 capabilities of these fast payment systems not only drive faster credit, but also it can open up better capillarity into accounts, wallets, and unlock working capital. There's this whole angle to economic growth that it can power. So that for me is a primary focus and need for alignment globally. And it's not about bilateral links or multilateral links. It is about having that freedom of choice and, have all of those, but also connect to a cross-border infrastructure like SWIFT under the payment scheme and unlock over 45,000 payment routes that exist on it today. The second piece, and this is a journey, many think that in November 2025, when the SWIFT network moved to ISO 20022 for payments initiation messages, it was the end of a journey. But really, that is the start of a journey of richer, structured data. And I think it's while the cross-border infrastructure has adopted ISO 20022, it still remains to be harmonized across different RTGSs. Different payment systems within the same country still have different data standards that they follow. So it is about alignment at the domestic level, and then that cross-border harmonization. And lastly, I think if we were to sum up all of this in terms of uplifting data quality and opening up fast payments, we need to basically accept the fact that real-time faster payments mean risks in real time. And with all of the nature of volatility that exists today across markets, geopolitics, risk, compliance, resilience becomes a top focus for markets, and it's across cybersecurity. It is about operational resilience, and it is about the ability to drive that real-time risk and compliance into every single transaction that flows into that country. So that for me is still top focus.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes sense. And I think especially the ISO point also resonates with me because it's one thing to define the technology standard, but then it's also the next step for people to use it consistently. And I think that's where, and that's not a Swift problem, right? This is for the industry really to make sure that the data is being used in the right way, that the right data is being provided, and that goes beyond the banking landscape as well. Corporates, people that use those services, they need to make sure they provide the right data to enable fast payments.
Absolutely, and you're spot on there, Jens, because ISO 20022 is an open data standard, right?
Mhm.
So it is across business domains, and as you mentioned, corporates need to make changes, banks need to make changes. It is about speaking that collective language into that future, that enables better automation, risk resilient, and we can build intelligent systems on top of this common data that layer that we're designing today.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, let's talk about something else that you've been working on. You released a new index recently, and I think that, and I'll let you talk about what that index is and what the purpose of that is. But could you tell us a little bit more about that and what you've actually seen as a result of that piece of work that you've done?
So I think yes, you've kind of sneakily looked at this new piece of exciting research which Swift has worked on with the industry, and it's very critical because it addresses the last mile problem and the frictions
Mhm.
that exist.
Mhm.
Um, when we looked at why payments are slow, and this is a journey, right? Like we've been coming up with the Spotlight on Speed series where we talk about what are the causes of friction and so on. But it was very difficult to benchmark it at some level. So the optimization index really is a benchmark for measurable frictions. So what it does is it can not only identify which frictions are related to slower processing, it can also enable direct comparison. So for individual countries, which is a better lever for optimization, right, across the levers which we've identified. And then it provides the empirical foundation for prioritized action at a domestic level and at a cross-border level. So when we look at the top areas of optimization, these have come up as regulatory requirements, capital and FX environments, and then, of course, we're speaking a lot about standards today. Then how risk and control is deployed. So when we talk about risk and controls, this is essentially about the financial crime and security behind the transaction inflows. And finally, domestic infrastructure. So I mean, it's going to be a very interesting piece of research, and we're very excited to bring that to the conference in Istanbul,
Mhm.
and do a deep dive in terms of a workshop, probably, Jens, because it's a massive piece of research. And if I were to kind of just talk through it today, I don't think I would be doing justice. And Yes, and it's the index basically builds on a number of measurable uh, data points that exist today, and we've curated that across the IMF, the World Bank, the BIS, the FATF, and we've built an economic statistical model that kind of correlates and scores these frictions for each country against the credit time that we see on Swift. Uh, Most importantly, I think we also have to understand that when you look at the G20 targets, it is talking about speed as a singular benchmark. So 75% of payments have to be credited within 1 hour. But when you look at economies and where they are in terms of their economic structure, in terms of the depth of their FX markets and how the currencies are traded, um, local regulations that deploy, it's a very uneven field. And what we see here is that the topmost friction is probably around capital and FX controls that exist within emerging markets, advanced emerging, to be very specific. And some of these delays cannot be, bypassed. It's beyond a particular business model or the infrastructure that's used to bring payments in, or or the currency of choice, and so on. So it really requires a rethink at this point in terms of policy, in terms of how we are actually implementing or how do I put it? How do we have reporting? How do we have some of the business rules and processes implemented within institutions that actually handle the payment? So that's a little bit, Jens. I think I've given you a very long answer, but uh, it is really a huge piece of research, and I think it deserves a room full of intellectuals, uh, practitioners, regulators, policymakers who really passionately believe in impacting change for the industry to come together at a venue like the one that you're putting together. So tell me a little bit about this conference, Jens. When is it? Why should we be excited about it?
Great. Well, thanks for setting that up so nicely. More than happy to. And maybe again for our listeners to understand some of the background here, Swift launched the Policy Lab at the Cybos conference in Frankfurt, which was very happy to attend at the time. Shriyanka was there as well. I think you're one of the driving forces behind the Policy Lab. And we talked about maybe we could use our central bank payment conference, which is an annual conference, to continue some of these conversations. So we're very happy that we're working with Swift at the next central bank payment conference in Istanbul. That's taking place the 31st of August to 2nd of September, where we are going to run like a mini version of a reduced version of the Policy Lab that started in Frankfurt, and looking at especially what we just talked about. So what are these frictions in payments? How can they be removed or at least reduced? And also, how does that hang together with the wider ecosystem? So we're not entirely looking only at cross-border payments, but we're also going to include the securities side of things as well, because that's also a topic where I guess somewhat anachronistically you're still looking in many places at a day+2 kind of settlement cycle on securities. So what can be done about that? And as you said, it needs some bright minds to be in the room, and we're gathering people from the public sector, so from central banks, regulators, from securities side as well, but also from the private sector, and get payment specialists, payment operators, etc., into the room. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and I'm grateful for the support we're getting from Swift in making this happen.
I think we're equally excited, Jens, and I think the Policy Lab collab idea originally started with our discussion, and now we are doing multiple Policy Lab collabs from Zurich to Kuala Lumpur to Istanbul, Hong Kong, and we're very excited to bring it all back into Miami later in the year for Cybos at the end of September. So Istanbul will really be that final pit stop before we bring all of these topical deep dives and regional deep dives back into the second annual Policy Lab at Cybos in Miami this year.
That's great. And since we talked about the index, and we will talk about that more in Istanbul, is it already available for public consumption, or what's the plan around the index?
Yes, we took some time to make it public, but it is available on swift.com to download. We've also done a number of closed-door bilateral readouts, as well as to a few policy committees as early test runs, because we needed to understand, is the data valuable? Is the research going to drive action at a domestic and cross-border level? And we've had very positive feedback and confidence. So it is available on swift.com. And I'm also happy to share the link for our listeners to download it so they come prepared to Istanbul.
Okay, great. Well, then look for the description of this podcast episode in your podcast app, and that should include that link, hopefully. If not, check out swift.com. But maybe just jumping quickly back to the workshop. I mean, sometimes workshops can be talking shops. I don't think that's what we're going for here, right? So what would be a good outcome from your perspective? What is it that you'd hope that the participants in that workshop can take away from the workshop and take back home with them?
So, to be very frank, the Payments Optimization Index gives you evidence for action, right? And then this whole piece of research is also accompanied by a playbook. And this is where we believe that when we convene, we can prioritize action, collective action specifically. And the idea is to examine and learn from each other in terms of strategies that are already being deployed in the market, which are the ones which are most effective, and to have this collective insight from the group to drive collaboration, coordinated action, and also maybe create a little bit of impetus, because if the index gets repeated, you want to look better on the index. And markets are already doing that. The G20 is a great end goal. The G20 targets a great end goal for coordinated action. But this index and the playbook and this workshop all bring data, insights, action, coordination, and then tie it up to real outcome and impact for the industry. So that's the real goal, Jens.
Sounds great. Excellent. Good. Well, I'm conscious of time, but before we wrap up, are there any other final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience? Any outlook maybe on what's beyond this workshop? Any final thoughts you'd like to share?
First and foremost, thank you for having me on the podcast, Jens. I look forward to being at the conference and doing, and taking questions on the index, on the frictions that we see, because it's been built over the years from tackling frictions, making changes on the SWIFT network, but also trying to understand where we need collective action, because at the end of the day, payments is a team sport, and SWIFT's role is to convene, create frameworks of progress, scale innovation, and sustain that momentum. So I look forward to ensuring that the index drives outcome, that the playbook becomes a true piece of coordinated action, like a charter for coordinated action, and most importantly, the networking and the ideas and the exchanges at the workshop. And with that, thank you once again to our listeners for listening and staying till the end.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Shriyanka. Thanks for joining the Pit Exchange. And thanks to all our listeners for tuning in today. Please do follow, do what you need to do on your podcast platform to stay in touch and don't miss any future episodes. Thank you and have a good one.
Thank you for listening to Pit Exchange, a podcast by Currency Research. This episode is part of our CBPC Roadshow series, 4 conversations leading up to the Central Bank Payments Conference this August. Watch the full series at centralbankpaymentsconference.com. Check out our upcoming events and publications at Currency Research and join us for the next stop on the CBPC Roadshow. We'll see you at the Central Bank Payments Conference this August.